Kang Tejin had spent enough money to buy a hospital, enough influence to silence governments, and enough blood to control half of Seoul's underworld. None of it had kept his wife alive. Before sunset, he would leave her grave and find a dying child waiting in the rain. The child would change the meaning of a prophecy he had tried to purchase his way out of, and before the night ended, he would make a promise strong enough to start a future war. The rain had not stopped since midnight. It fell on the black umbrellas of 200 mourners, on the polished stone of the family plot, on the coffin that men who feared him now lowered with careful trembling hands. Tejin stood at the edge of the grave with his hands folded in front of him, his face arranged into the same stillness he wore in boardrooms and in rooms where men begged for their lives. No one watching him could have said whether he was breaking apart or made of stone. That was the only mercy left to him now that, after 45 years of discipline, grief could not force its way past the wall he had built. He did not look away as the coffin disappeared into the earth. He made himself watch. The way he made himself watch every consequence of every decision he had ever made, because looking away was a luxury he had never permitted himself, and he would not begin on the day he buried Yuna. Beside him, his mother, Madame Sunhee, stood with an umbrella she did not seem to notice was tilting rain onto her shoulder. She was 71 years old, and had buried a husband and 2 brothers, and now watched her son bury a wife, and something in her still stood straighter than the young men around her in their black suits and earpieces. "She is not gone from you," Sunhee said quietly, not looking at him. "Only from your hands." "Don't," Tejin said. His voice did not rise. It never rose. "Not today. The old man on the mountain told you this would happen. He told you nothing could save her. He was wrong about everything else." "He was not wrong," Sunhee said. "He was only early." She finally looked at him, her eyes calm and unreadable in the way that had always made grown men uncomfortable in her presence. "He said after your greatest loss, a gift would be placed in your hands. A gift does not replace what was lost, Tejin. It only proves that heaven has not finished with you yet." Tejin said nothing. He watched the first shovel of dark earth fall onto the coffin lid, and something in his chest closed like a door being locked from the inside. He remembered without wanting to. The mountain temple 3 months earlier, the incense smoke curling toward a low wooden ceiling, the old prophet's eyes clouded with cataracts, but somehow seeing more than any doctor with perfect vision ever had. Tejin had gone there out of desperation, not faith, dragged by his mother's insistence after the 4th oncologist in as many countries had delivered the same verdict in different languages. He remembered gripping the arm of his chair as the old man spoke without being asked a single question. "The woman you love cannot be saved," the prophet had said. "Stop trying to purchase what heaven has already called home." Tejin had stood to leave. He was not a man who paid to be told what he refused to hear. "After your greatest loss," the old man had continued, as though Tejin had not moved at all, "a greater gift will be placed in your hands. You will mistake it for weakness. Others will mistake it for power. Protect it before you understand it." He had thought of new territory. He had thought of the shipping routes his rivals controlled through the western ports, of the security contracts he had been trying to win from the government for 2 years, of the possibility that some enemy's empire might fall into his hands the way empires sometimes did, quietly, through debt and blood rather than declared war. He had thought of everything except a child, because a child had never once been part of the future he allowed himself to imagine. The funeral ended the way funerals for men like Tejin always ended, with a line of black cars gliding away from the cemetery in perfect formation, security vehicles ahead and behind, drivers trained never to ask questions about the silence that filled the interior of the lead car. He sat in the back seat with his hand resting on the space beside him, the space where Yuna would have sat for the last 11 years, her hand always finding his without either of them looking. The seat was empty now, in a way that felt like a physical fact of the world. a hole in the fabric of the car itself, and he made himself remove his hand from it and place it in his lap. Park Daejo sat across from him, his second in command for 15 years, a man who had taken bullets meant for Tejin and given orders that ended other men's lives without ever raising his voice above a murmur. Daejo did not speak. He understood better than anyone alive that there were silences that should not be filled. The rain came harder as they left the cemetery grounds and merged onto the road that ran along the edge of the old industrial district. Warehouses and shuttered factories rising gray and indifferent against a sky the color of wet ash. Tejin stared out the window without seeing any of it. Then he heard it. Faint, almost nothing. A thread of sound beneath the drumming of rain on the roof and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. A cry, high, weak, and unmistakably human. "Stop the car," Tejin said. Daejo frowned. "Sir?" "Stop the car," Tejin said again, and something in his tone made Daejo lift the radio to his mouth immediately, relaying the order down the line of vehicles before he had even fully processed it. The convoy slowed and pulled to the shoulder of the road, 4 black cars idling in the rain beside a stretch of cracked pavement and a half-collapsed roadside shrine that travelers had once used to leave offerings for safe passage before the factories closed and the district emptied, and the shrine was left to rot beneath a leaning tin roof. "I didn't hear anything, sir," Daejo said carefully. "The men in the front car didn't report anything either." "I heard a child," Tejin said, already reaching for the door handle. "Get me an umbrella and stay in the car. Sir, with respect, this is not secured ground. If someone wanted to draw you out of a moving convoy, they would have picked a better trap than a crying child in the rain." "Stay here," Tejin said. He stepped out into the storm without waiting for the umbrella, his black suit soaking through within seconds, his shoes filling with cold water as he crossed the broken pavement toward the shrine. The cry came again, weaker this time, and he followed it around the side of the collapsing structure to where a woven basket sat tucked beneath the remains of the tin roof, half shielded from the worst of the rain, but not enough. He stopped. Inside the basket, wrapped in cloth so fine it seemed to belong to a different world than the one it had been abandoned in, lay a newborn girl. Her lips had gone faintly blue at the edges. Her cry had thinned to something closer to a whimper, the sound of a body running out of the strength to protest its own suffering. The cloth around her, despite the rain, was extraordinary, pale silk edged in hand-stitched thread, a small symbol worked into the border that Tejin did not recognize and did not have the presence of mind to study. He crouched beside the basket and checked with 2 fingers against her tiny chest whether she was breathing at all. She was, but barely, each breath shallow and fast, her small brown fists curled tight against the cold. She cried once more, a thin, broken sound, and Tejin lifted her out of the basket without deciding to, the way a man's hands sometimes act before his mind has finished catching up. The moment his hands closed around her, she stopped crying. She turned her face toward him, her eyes barely open, and one small hand worked its way free of the wet cloth and reached toward his jaw, fingers brushing his skin, the way a person reaches for something they already know. Tejin went very still. Yuna had touched his face like that, in her final weeks, her fingers thinned by illness, but her touch unmistakably the same gesture, seeking his jaw before she spoke, as though she needed to confirm he was really there before she trusted her words to him. He had not thought of it in exactly that shape until this moment, kneeling in the rain with a dying infant's hand against his face, and something in his chest that had been sealed shut all day cracked, just slightly, just enough to let something through that he did not have a name for yet. Daejo appeared at his shoulder, having disobeyed the order to stay in the car the moment he saw Tejin crouch and not rise. He held an umbrella over both of them, water now running off its edges onto his own shoulders. "Sir, we should call the police. Whoever left her, call the doctor," Tejin said. "Sir," An abandoned infant is a matter for... Call Dr. Seo, Tejin said, rising to his feet with the baby cradled against his soaked chest, shielding her small face from the rain with his hand. Now, Dejo. Dejo looked at him for a long moment, then lifted the radio without further argument, because, in 15 years he had learned exactly which of Tejin's quiet tones could not be negotiated with. The decision, Tejin understood even as he carried her back toward the car, had already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought, in the same place decisions were made before he ever announced them to the men who worked for him. He would tell himself later that night, and for several nights after, that this was temporary, that he was only doing what any decent man would do for a dying child found by chance. Some part of him, walking through the rain with her small weight against his chest, already understood that nothing about this evening was temporary at all. The Kang estate rose out of the hillside above the city like something built to withstand siege, which in a sense it had been. Stone walls and iron gates, and a garden that had once been Yuna's private kingdom, now overgrown at the edges because Tejin had ordered the gardeners not to touch it, and then found he could not bear to look at it either. The house had been silent for 3 days, ever since Yuna's body had been taken to the funeral home, silent in the specific way of a house built for 2 people that now held only one. He had walked through that silence every morning since, setting out 2 cups from habit before catching himself and putting one away again, a small daily wound. He had not found a way to stop inflicting on himself. He had asked the staff to remove every vase of flowers from the reception rooms after the 3rd day, unable to bear the sweetness of them arriving daily from well-wishers who did not understand that sympathy delivered in fragrant bundles only sharpened the absence it was meant to soften. Tonight, for the first time since the diagnosis had first darkened this house, he carried something through its doors that was not grief. The infant's cry, thin as it was, echoed through the marble entryway with a strange finality, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for a reason to make sound again. Dr. Seo Dongwan arrived within the hour, a slight man in his late 50s who had served the Kang family's medical needs, official and otherwise, for over a decade, and who had long ago learned to ask fewer questions than his conscience preferred. He examined the baby on a blanket spread across the kitchen island, because the house had no nursery, had never needed one, and every guest room felt too formal for what needed to happen quickly. "She's dehydrated," Dr. Seo said, his hands moving with the brisk efficiency of a man used to working under pressure. "Mild hypothermia. Her core temperature is low but not critical. If she'd been left out there another hour, perhaps 2..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "She's no more than 3 or 4 days old. Full term. From the look of her, someone cared for her properly until very recently. Her cord stump is clean. She's been fed at some point. This wasn't neglect from birth. Then why was she left in the rain to die?" Tejin said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know," Dr. Seo said. "I can tell you what I see. She appears to be of mixed heritage, Korean, and I would guess West African, possibly Nigerian given the coloring and the texture of her hair. There's no documentation with her, no hospital bracelet, no note, nothing beyond the basket and this cloth." He held up the fine silk, now drying on a towel beside him. "This is not the cloth of a family that couldn't afford to keep her, Mr. Kang. This is handwork. Expensive handwork. Someone wanted her wrapped in something that mattered. There's a mark," Tejin said, looking at the small symbol stitched into the border, a shape he still could not place, something between a crest and a character from an alphabet he didn't recognize. "I don't know what it is," Dr. Seo admitted. "I've never seen it before. I'd recommend you contact the proper authorities, Mr. Kang. An undocumented infant creates enormous legal exposure. If anyone learns she's here without the correct paperwork..." "No one will learn," Tejin said. Dr. Seo looked up at him, and something in his old friend's expression made him choose his next words with unusual care. "Sir, One understand the impulse, I do. But keeping a child with no papers, no registered guardian, in a house like this one, surrounded by the kind of attention your name attracts, that is not a small risk. If something happens to her medically and there's no legal record of her existence, I cannot protect her the way a hospital could. She stays until we know who left her, Tejin said. And even as the words left his mouth, he heard how thin the excuse sounded, how obviously it was already something else dressed up as a temporary arrangement. Find out everything you can about her condition. I want a full report. And, doctor, this does not leave this house. Dr. SEO held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had made this same compromise with his conscience many times before, and would apparently make it once more. Behind them, in the doorway of the kitchen, Madame Sunhee stood watching, her wet coat still over her shoulders, having followed the convoy home the moment word reached her that her son had stopped the cars in the rain. She said nothing. She only looked at the baby on the blanket, at the small chest rising and falling more steadily now under the warming lamp Dr. SEO had positioned over her, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but held pieces of both. God whispers before he moves, she murmured, so quietly that only Tejin, standing closest to her, heard it at all. He did not answer her. He was looking at the baby's hand, curled now around one of Dr. Seo's fingers, and thinking of another hand that had once curled the same way around his own. Sunhee lingered in the kitchen doorway a while longer, watching her son stand very still beside a child who was not his blood, in a house that had buried his wife only hours earlier. And she thought, not for the first time, that grief moved through men like Tejin the way water moved through stone, slowly, invisibly, and yet capable, given enough time, of carving a man into an entirely different shape than the one he had been born with. She did not say any of this aloud. She had learned across 71 years and the burial of nearly everyone she had ever loved that some truths needed to be lived into rather than spoken into. And she left the kitchen without another word, trusting the night to do the rest of the work on its own. By midnight, Daejo had assembled what little could be learned from the scene at the shrine. He laid it out for Tejin in the study, the room where Tejin conducted the business no one was permitted to discuss outside these walls, though tonight the only business under discussion was a basket in the rain. The traffic camera 200 meters up the road went dark for exactly 17 minutes, Daejo said. Not damaged, disabled remotely, and reactivated afterward like nothing happened. That's not amateur work, sir. That's someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and had the access to take one down without leaving a trace of forced entry. Hospitals, nothing. No hospital within 200 kilometers has reported a missing newborn. No birth records flagged. No distressed mother presenting for postpartum care and then vanishing. Whoever delivered her did not do it through any system I can search. The basket, cheap, ordinary, bought to be disposable, probably paid for in cash somewhere no one would remember the buyer. The cloth is the opposite. I had one of our people who used to work in textiles look at the stitching, hand done, not machine, and done by someone with real training. That symbol worked into the border. She didn't recognize it either. Said it wasn't any family crest she'd ever catalogued, not any of the chaebol houses, not any of the old noble families that still mark their heirlooms. She said it looked older than that, possibly ceremonial, and the footprints. Daejo's voice sharpened slightly, the tone he used when he had found something that troubled him. 2 sets. One set carried the weight of the basket toward the shrine, set it down, and left quickly on foot toward the old rail access road. The second set parked a vehicle on the far side of the lot and stood watching for some time before driving away. Tire marks suggest a sedan. Nothing distinctive. Could be any of 10,000 cars in this city. Someone watched her be left there, Tejin said slowly. And watched to make sure she was found, Daejo said. Or watched to make sure something else happened. Sir, one don't like any part of this. A baby left exactly on the route your convoy would take home from a funeral. The whole city knew about it. A camera disabled for the precise window she'd be there, a watcher confirming the outcome. This has the shape of something built for you to find her. I don't know why, I don't know by whom, but I would be failing you if I didn't say it plainly. This could be a trap we haven't sprung the second half of yet. Tejin sat with that for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the posture he took when weighing a decision that would have consequences beyond the room he was sitting in. "Keep investigating," he said finally, quietly. "I want to know who left her and why, and I want to know before whoever is watching decides to move again. But nothing about her presence in this house changes tonight. Dejo, do you understand me?" "I understand you're not asking my opinion on that part," Dejo said, with the particular dry honesty that 15 years of service had earned him the right to use. "I'll keep digging, sir. Just be careful. A man in your position with a visible weakness is a man other men will test." "She's not a weakness," Tejin said, though he heard, as he said it, that he did not sound entirely certain, and that Dejo heard it too. He did not hold her again that first night. Not after carrying her in from the rain and setting her into Dr. Seo's care. He told himself it was practicality, that Nurse Min Jin, the private pediatric nurse Dr. Seo had called in within the hour, understood infant care in ways he did not, and that his presence would only be in the way. He stood in the doorway of the guest room they had hastily converted into a nursery, watching Nurse Min Jin settle the baby into a bassinet that had been driven over from a private medical supply warehouse at Tejin's order, arriving within 90 minutes of the call, despite the hour and the storm. "You can come closer, Mr. Kang," Nurse Min Jin said, without looking up from what she was doing. A woman in her 50s, with the unhurried competence of someone who had cared for hundreds of infants and been unsettled by none of them, including apparently a Mafia boss standing rigid in a doorway. "She won't break. I'm fine here," Tejin said. "Attachment is not what makes a child vulnerable," Nurse Min Jin said, still not looking at him, tucking a blanket around the small form with practiced hands. "Being unloved is what makes a child vulnerable. You found her in a storm and carried her home in your arms. Standing in the doorway now to prove you feel nothing is a strange way to finish that story." Tejin said nothing. He did not appreciate being read so plainly by a woman he had known for 2 hours, but he also found, uncomfortably, that he did not disagree with her. The baby began to cry, a thin, unsettled sound, and Nurse Min Jin lifted her and rocked her and murmured to her in the low, practiced tones of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And still the crying continued, rising rather than settling. "She's not hungry, she's not wet, she's not cold," Nurse Min Jin said, half to herself, checking each possibility with brisk efficiency. "She's just unsettled. New place, new hands, everything strange to her." She glanced toward the doorway. "Come here, Mr. Kang. I told you Come here," Nurse Min Jin said again, in a tone that had clearly stopped working for hospital administrators decades ago, and had no intention of stopping now, for a man who ran half the city's underworld. Tejin crossed the room, feeling absurd, feeling exposed in a way boardrooms and gunfights never made him feel, and stood beside the bassinet as Nurse Min Jin lifted the crying infant and, without asking permission, settled her into his arms. The baby stopped crying. It happened almost instantly, her small face turning toward him, her cries dissolving into a few hiccuping breaths, and then silence. Her eyes finding his, in the low lamplight of the room, with an intensity that felt absurdly deliberate. "Well," Nurse Min Jin said, watching this with an expression Tejin couldn't quite read, "there's your answer then." He held her a moment longer than necessary, feeling the impossible lightness of her, the trust in the way her body settled against his chest, and then he set her carefully back into the bassinet and stepped away, because staying felt like agreeing to something he was not yet ready to say aloud. The crying began again the moment he reached the door. He stopped. He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway with his back to the room, listening to her cry, and told himself that this proved nothing, that infants cried, that this was simply what infants did, and that it had nothing to do with him specifically. He went to bed and did not sleep. And some hours before dawn, he found himself walking the hallway toward the nursery again, telling himself he only wanted to confirm she was breathing. She quieted the moment he entered. He stood over the bassinet in the dark and watched her sleep, and for the first time in 3 days, the house did not feel entirely like a tomb. The next morning, needing a blanket he was certain still existed somewhere in the house, Tejin found himself standing outside a door he had not opened since the day the ambulance took Yuna to the hospital for the last time. He had ordered the staff to leave the room untouched. He had ordered the flowers removed from every other part of the house, unable to bear their sweetness in rooms where he now moved alone. But Yuna's room he had sealed rather than emptied, as though closing the door might somehow suspend time on the other side of it. He opened it now. Sunlight filtered through curtains that had not been drawn in weeks, dust motes turning slowly in the pale morning light, and the room smelled faintly of her, of the perfume she had worn since before he knew her, a smell that hit him with a force he had not braced for. He found the blanket he was looking for in the second drawer of her dresser, soft cream wool she had bought years earlier and never used, kept, he now understood, for a child she had never stopped hoping for. Beneath it, tucked into the back corner of the drawer, was a small wooden box he did not recognize. He opened it. Inside were baby items, tiny knitted socks, a rattle shaped like a rabbit, 2 hospital bracelets from pregnancies that had ended before they ever reached a delivery room, kept apparently as the only physical proof that those children had existed at all, even briefly. Beneath these was a folded piece of paper, and on it, in Yuna's careful handwriting, a list of names. Several were crossed out. One was circled twice, Hana. Beneath the list, in smaller writing, as though she had added it in a private moment months or years after making the list itself, was a short note. If heaven ever gives us a daughter, call her Hana. I want her to know she was our first gift, even if she arrived last. And Tejin, if you ever find yourself protecting someone the way you protect your empire, remember that protecting is not the same as owning. Let her be free even while you keep her safe. That is the only kind of love I ever wanted from you, and the only kind I would want you to give. Tejin sat down on the edge of the bed, the note in his hands, and did not move for a long time. He did not go directly to the nursery. He told himself the note meant nothing beyond what it was, a wish Yuna had written in a private moment for a child who had never come, a child he was not obligated to summon into being simply because a stranger's baby had appeared in the rain on the day of her funeral. He told himself the coincidence of the name, of the timing, meant nothing at all, that grief made men see patterns in chaos because chaos was harder to bear than meaning, even false meaning. He told himself this several times over the following days, and found that he believed it a little less each time he said it. 3 days after the baby's arrival, Dejo came to him with a different kind of report, one that carried an edge of urgency the earlier briefings had not. A vehicle's been spotted twice near the estate's outer perimeter, Dejo said. Once yesterday evening, once again this morning. Different car both times, but the same pattern. Parked just outside the range of our cameras, engine running, gone within 10 minutes. Watching the house. That's my read, sir, and there's more. Dejo's jaw tightened. Someone called Seoul National Hospital's maternity intake line yesterday, asking whether a mixed-race newborn had been brought in for treatment in the last week. Called 2 of your private clinics with the same question this morning. Whoever it is, they're searching systematically, and they're getting closer to us. Tejin absorbed this in silence, standing at the window of his study, looking down over the garden Yuna had loved, still overgrown, still untouched. Someone is looking for her. Someone is looking for her, Dejo agreed. Which means whoever left her either regrets it or was never meant to leave her permanently, or, and I have to say this, sir, Wants confirmation that she survived before they move on her again for a different reason entirely. I don't know which. I don't like any of the options. There's one more thing, Dejo said. And something in the set of his shoulders told Tejin this was the part he had been reluctant to lead with. 2 nights ago, one of the perimeter sensors on the east wall triggered briefly, just after 2 in the morning. By the time the response team reached the location, whoever tripped it was gone. But they left something behind. He set a small object on the desk between them, a child's cloth doll, handmade, its stitching similar in style, though not identical, to the fine work on the cloth Hana had been wrapped in. It wasn't left carelessly, sir. It was placed deliberately on the wall itself, facing the house. Whoever left it wanted us to know they'd been close enough to touch the property and chose not to come further. Tejin picked up the doll and turned it over in his hands, studying the small stitched face. The same unfamiliar symbol worked faintly into the hem of its tiny dress. A warning, or a message. Or both, Dejo said. I don't like reading intentions from objects, sir, but I like the timing even less. Someone confirmed she's alive, confirmed she's here, and left proof of how close they can get without our men seeing them arrive or leave. That's not the work of an amateur searching for a lost baby. That's the work of someone testing the edges of your security on purpose. What do you recommend? Officially, through proper channels, into state custody, where she'd have documentation and protection that doesn't depend on the discretion of men who work for you, Dejo said. I know that's not what you want to hear, but if this is a trap, sir, the safest place for her is somewhere your enemies can't reach either of you at once. Right now she's a liability sitting in the middle of your own house. Tejin considered this for a long moment, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that his mind had already rejected it before Dejo finished speaking, not out of stubbornness, but out of something that felt uncomfortably like instinct protecting its own. He went to the nursery that evening, intending only to look in on her before making the decision Dejo had recommended, telling himself he owed her that much consideration before signing her over to a system that would swallow her into paperwork and strangers' hands. She was awake when he entered, her dark eyes finding him immediately in the low lamplight, and as he stepped closer to the bassinet, preparing himself to turn and leave to begin the process Dejo had outlined, her small hand found his finger and gripped it with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. He stood there for a long time, unable to make himself pull away. No record leaves this house, he told Dejo the next morning, and something in his own voice told him this decision, unlike so many others he had made in his life, was not entirely rational, and he found he did not care. Increase the perimeter security. Rotate the watch schedules so no pattern can be studied from outside. Keep investigating who's searching for her, and keep it quiet. But she stays. Dejo studied him for a long moment, the look of a man who had followed orders he privately disagreed with many times before, and would follow this one too, but wanted his reservations known first. Understood, sir. I'll do everything I can to keep her safe here. I just wanted it on record that I think you're choosing the harder road. I know, Tejin said. Do it anyway. The days that followed took on a shape Tejin had not expected, and would not have believed himself capable of a week earlier. He learned, clumsily at first, how to hold her properly, how to support the impossibly fragile weight of her head, how to read the difference between a hungry cry and a tired one. Skills nurse Min Jin taught him with the brisk patience of a woman who had apparently decided, without consulting him, that a father who watched from doorways was not a father worth raising a child under his roof. You're not paying me to do everything for her while you observe from a safe distance, Mr. Kang, she told him on the 4th day, handing him a bottle with an expression that permitted no argument. You found her in the rain. You can feed her at 2 in the morning like the rest of us. He fed her at 2 in the morning, sitting in the nursery's single armchair with the house silent around him, and found something in the quiet routine of it that felt unexpectedly like the first peaceful hour he had known since Yuna's diagnosis. He talked to her in those small hours because the silence otherwise felt too heavy to sit inside alone. He told himself it was foolish, talking to an infant who understood nothing of what he said, but he found himself doing it anyway, walking the long hallway of the estate with her weight against his shoulder, telling her about Una, about the garden she had planted with her own hands, about the way she had laughed at his seriousness and somehow made him lighter for it rather than resenting him for the weight he carried. He discovered by accident that she settled instantly whenever the staff played the old recording of Una humming a melody she used to sing while gardening, a habit one of the housekeepers remembered and revived without being asked. He would stand in the doorway and listen to the baby's breathing slow into sleep beneath that half-remembered tune, and something in his chest would loosen that had been clenched tight since the funeral. She spit up on his suit jacket during a feeding on the 6th day, an expensive gray wool he had worn to a meeting with shipping partners that afternoon, and the 2 staff members present had to work very hard not to laugh at the expression on his face. He very nearly smiled himself, catching it before it fully formed, though Nurse Min Jin, watching from the doorway, saw enough of it to comment on it later. "There it is," she said, handing him a cloth. "I was beginning to wonder if you had one left in you." "I have several," Tejin said, dabbing uselessly at the ruined jacket. "I simply reserve them for occasions that deserve them, and a soiled $2,000 jacket doesn't." "A soiled $2,000 jacket deserves precisely the amount I gave it," he said. And Nurse Min Jin, to her own apparent surprise, laughed outright, a short bark of genuine delight that echoed strangely in a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter for weeks. He learned other things in those days that no one had ever thought to teach a man like him. He learned that a diaper, applied incorrectly under pressure at 3 in the morning, could undo the composure of a man who had once dismantled a rival's entire smuggling operation without breaking a sweat. He learned the particular embarrassing satisfaction of finally getting it right on the second attempt, and the way Hana's indifference to his struggle, her calm acceptance of his clumsy hands, felt like a kind of forgiveness he had not known he needed. He learned that she preferred to be walked rather than rocked, that her crying softened fastest when he hummed rather than spoke, though his humming, by his own admission and everyone else's, was tuneless and unremarkable, and that she did not seem to care in the slightest. One evening, unable to sleep, he found himself in the estate's old sitting room, with her settled in the crook of one arm, while he read through shipping manifests with the other hand, a habit he had fallen into simply because the alternative, lying awake in a bed too large for one person, felt worse than working through exhaustion. She stayed awake through most of it, her dark eyes tracking the lamp, the ceiling, occasionally his face, with the unfocused curiosity of an infant discovering the world existed at all. He found himself narrating the manifest to her in a low voice, explaining shipping routes and tariff codes to a 3-week-old child who understood none of it, and stopped only when he realized how absurd it looked, and then continued anyway because it no longer felt as though anyone in the house would judge him for it. The staff noticed the change before he was willing to admit it to himself. The head housekeeper, a woman who had served the family for over 20 years and had wept openly at Una's funeral, began leaving small things in the nursery without being asked: soft toys, a new mobile to supplement Una's paper cranes, a rocking chair moved in from a guest room because she had noticed Mr. Kang standing for hours rather than sitting, as though sitting might signal a permanence he wasn't yet ready to claim. He noticed the chair the second night it appeared, and said nothing about it, and sat in it the following evening without comment, and the housekeeper, watching from the hallway, allowed herself a small private smile before continuing on her rounds. The estate staff, without ever discussing it aloud, began referring to her as the Little Miss. Tejin corrected them the first several times he heard it, reminding them her status in the household was not yet settled, that they should not speak as though decisions had been made that hadn't been. By the second week, he had stopped correcting them. His guards, hardened men who had killed for him without hesitation, grew quietly protective in ways that surprised him. He noticed the night shift lingering longer near the nursery windows than their patrol routes strictly required. He noticed one of his most dangerous enforcers, a man who had once broken another man's hand for touching Tejin's car without permission, standing very still and very careful. The one time Nurse Min Jin asked him to hold the baby for a moment while she fetched a fresh bottle, his enormous hands cradling her, as though she were made of glass. It was Daeho who finally forced the conversation Tejin had been avoiding. "I need you to hear something you won't want to hear," Daeho said, standing in the study one evening, a little over 2 weeks after the baby's arrival, his expression grave. "Keeping her here endangers this entire organization, and I think you already know that, sir, which is why you haven't asked me to stop saying it. Every enemy you have will eventually learn she exists, and the moment they do, she becomes leverage. Not a person to them, sir, a lever. Something to threaten, something to take, something to use against you in exactly the way I know you're already imagining, because I've seen the way you look at the perimeter cameras now. You're not protecting her from a stranger who left her in the rain anymore. You're protecting her from everyone who will ever learn your name and hers in the same sentence. Then they will learn what happens to men who reach for her," Tejin said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the particular stillness that men in his organization had learned to fear more than shouting ever could. "I believe you," Daeho said. "I have watched you make good on threats quieter than that one. But I have to ask you something, and I need you to actually consider it rather than simply be angry at me for asking." He paused. "Are you protecting her, sir, or are you using her to survive Yuna's death? Because those are not the same thing. And if you can't tell the difference yet, neither can I. And neither, eventually, will she." Tejin did not answer immediately. The question sat in the room between them, uncomfortable and unresolved, and Tejin found, with some anger at himself, that he genuinely did not know how to answer it. "Get out," he said finally, not unkindly, but with an edge that told Daeho the conversation was over. Daeho left without further argument. But the question did not leave with him. It followed Tejin down the hallway that night into the nursery, where he stood over the bassinet longer than usual, watching her sleep, searching his own chest for an answer he was afraid to find. He thought of the men he had killed, or ordered killed, in the years since he had inherited his father's territory and expanded it into something far larger and far more feared. He had never once asked himself, in the moment of any of those decisions, whether he was acting out of necessity or out of something uglier, that necessity made convenient to hide behind. He had always assumed the question did not apply to him, that he acted only when action was required, that the empire he built was simply the shape survival took in his world. Daeho's question unsettled him precisely because it applied that same discipline of self-examination to a place he had never thought to point it, and he did not like what he found when he finally looked. He was protecting her. He was certain of that much. But Daeho was not entirely wrong either, and Tejin, standing over the crib in the dark, made himself admit it in the privacy of his own mind, if nowhere else. Some part of him had reached for her in that rain, not only because she was dying and he could not let a child die in front of him, but because his hands had been empty since Yuna's illness began, empty of anything to hold on to, anything to fight for, that he had any hope of saving. Hana had given him something to save. Whether that made his love for her any less real, he did not know. He only knew that the question would need answering honestly, and often, for as long as he intended to raise her, and he resolved, standing there in the dark, that he would not let himself off easily each time it resurfaced. Madame Sun-hee, who had taken to visiting the nursery every afternoon, formed her own quiet bond with the child that grew steadily alongside her son's. She brought down from storage the paper crane mobile Yuna had folded by hand during her worst weeks of chemotherapy, hundreds of small cranes in fading colors that had once hung above a hospital bed and now turned slowly above a bassinet instead. She should have something of Yuna's watching over her, Sun-hee said, hanging the mobile herself, refusing help from the staff. Not because she is Yuna returned to us. She isn't, Tejin. Do not make that mistake. She should never be made to carry a dead woman's identity on top of her own. Not by you. Not by anyone in this house. I don't think that, Tejin said, though he was not entirely certain it was true. Good, son, he said, because loving this child would not betray Yuna's memory. And I think some part of you fears it would. Grief and love can live in the same house, Tejin. They can even live in the same heart at the same time without one destroying the other. I promise you this, because I have lived it myself more than once. She watched him for a long moment, then added more gently, do not make this child responsible for saving you from your grief. That is too heavy a weight to give an infant who cannot even lift her own head yet. Save yourself so that you are strong enough to raise her. She does not need a broken man pretending her presence has fixed him. She needs a whole one, even if he becomes whole slowly, even if he becomes whole imperfectly. Tejin said nothing, but he thought about her words for many nights afterward, sitting in the nursery in the small hours, watching the paper cranes turn slowly above the child he had, still, after 2 weeks, refused to name. He told himself the reason was practical, that naming her was premature while her origins remained unknown, while the watchers outside the estate walls remained unidentified, while the possibility remained that someone might yet come to claim her and undo whatever bond he allowed himself to form. But he understood, somewhere beneath the practical reasoning, that naming her meant admitting she was staying, and admitting she was staying meant admitting he had already chosen her weeks ago, in the rain, before he ever let himself think the word father. The crisis, when it came, arrived without warning on a night 18 days after he had carried her home. Nurse Min Jin's voice woke him before he had even registered the words, sharp and urgent in a way she had never used before, calling for Dr. Seo, calling for Tejin, calling in a tone that cut through sleep like cold water. He reached the nursery to find the baby's small chest working too fast, her lips tinged faintly blue, her cry gone thin and wrong in a way that struck something primal and terrified in him that he did not have words for. Dr. Seo arrived within minutes, having been kept on standby in a guest wing since the night she arrived, and worked over her with quick, controlled urgency, while Tejin stood pressed against the wall, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely powerless. He had faced armed men without flinching. He had negotiated with his life on the table more times than he could count. None of it had prepared him for the particular helplessness of watching a doctor work over a struggling infant, while every resource he possessed, every dollar, every connection, every ounce of feared authority, proved useless against the simple fragility of a small failing body. She's stabilizing, Dr. Seo said at last, some eternity later, his own hands not quite steady as he adjusted the oxygen line taped gently beneath her nose. It was a bout of apnea, not uncommon in infants who've experienced early trauma like exposure and hypothermia. She'll need close monitoring for the next several nights, but she's stable now, Mr. Kang. She's going to be all right. The room emptied slowly around him, Nurse Min Jin and Dr. Seo stepping out to prepare monitoring equipment, leaving Tejin alone beside the crib in the low lamplight, and he sat down in the armchair Nurse Min Jin had claimed as his weeks earlier, and did not move for a long time. He looked at her small chest rising and falling, steady now, and understood, with a clarity that felt like something breaking open inside him, that he had already loved her before this moment, had loved her since the rain, since her hand found his jaw at the shrine, and that the terror of nearly losing her tonight had simply stripped away the last of his own denial about it. He thought of Yuna's note, folded now in the drawer of his own desk, where he had kept it since finding it. Protecting is not the same as owning. He thought of the prophet's words, misunderstood for months. A greater gift will be placed in your hands, and understood, finally and completely, that the gift had never been territory or power or the fall of an enemy. It had been the chance to love someone again, when he had believed that part of himself buried in the ground alongside his wife. He thought of the 2 adult footprints Daijo had found at the shrine, one carrying the basket forward, one watching from a distance to confirm the outcome. Somewhere out there, a person had made the hardest decision of their own life on the same night Tejin had made his, and had trusted a stranger they could not have known would stop his car for a sound most men would have missed entirely in the rain, to finish what they could not. He did not know why. He did not know if he would ever know why. But sitting beside her crib in the low lamplight, feeling the last of his resistance give way entirely, he found that gratitude had crept in alongside the grief and the fear. Gratitude toward a stranger who had chosen, for reasons still hidden, to place their most precious thing directly into his path, rather than anywhere else in a city of 10 million people. "Hana," he said quietly, testing the name aloud for the first time, his voice rough in the silent room. Her eyes opened. She turned her small face toward him, and her hand found his finger through the bars of the crib and gripped it. The same gesture as that first night in the rain, the same trust given without hesitation to a man who had spent his entire life ensuring no one trusted him without cause. "Welcome home," he said. She held his finger and did not let go, and Tejin sat with her through the rest of the night, unwilling to leave, unwilling to break whatever fragile thread had finally, fully connected them. By morning, he was a different man in the small, decisive ways that mattered most. He called Daijo into the study before breakfast, and gave instructions with the same clarity and finality he used when reorganizing his territory after a rival's fall. "I want lawful guardianship established through discrete channels," he said. "Real documentation, not something that dissolves the moment someone asks the wrong question. Continue the search for whoever left her, and continue investigating the symbol on that cloth. I want to know where it comes from and what it means. Secure the estate further, but I don't want her raised behind bars, Daijo. She is not a prisoner in this house. She is my daughter, and she will be protected the way a daughter is protected, not the way a hostage is guarded." "Understood, sir," Daijo said. And something in his expression, some quiet approval beneath the professional composure, told Tejin the answer had satisfied whatever reservations Daijo still carried, at least for now. "I'll have the guardianship paperwork moving within the week. And, sir, her name, Hana. It suits her. Yuna chose it," Tejin said, "years before either of us knew she'd ever have the chance to use it." That night, once the house had gone quiet and the last of the staff had retired, Tejin carried Hana through the darkened halls of the estate to the garden gate he had not opened since the week Yuna died. He unlatched it and stepped through into the overgrown wilderness Yuna had once tended with such devotion, roses gone wild and climbing where they pleased. The small stone bench where she used to sit in the evenings now half swallowed by ivy. He sat on the bench, with Hana settled against his chest, and looked up at the same stars Yuna had once pointed out to him, naming constellations with more confidence than accuracy, laughing at his skepticism. "I don't know why you were left where I would find you," he told the sleeping child softly. "I don't know who left you, or who is searching for you now, or what any of it means. I can't promise you a gentle life. You were born into mine, and my life has never been gentle to anyone in it. But I can promise you this: no one will abandon you again, not while I have breath to stop it." She slept against him, small and impossibly trusting, and Tejin felt something break loose in his chest that he had held rigid since the moment the doctors first told him nothing more could be done for Yuna. A single tear traced down his face, quiet, brief, gone almost as soon as it fell, and he did not fight it, and he did not apologize for it, because there was no one in the garden to see it but the child who had, in 18 days, become the reason he still had a reason to stand in gardens at all. He understood, sitting there beneath Yuna's stars, that the prophet's warning had not fully closed. "Others will mistake it for power," the old man had said, and Tejin had not forgotten it. Even in this moment of quiet grace, whoever had left Hana at that shrine whoever had watched from the parked car to confirm she was found, whoever was calling hospitals asking after a mixed-race newborn, that danger had not passed, simply because he had chosen to love her. If anything, it had only just begun to circle closer. He thought of the seat beside him in the car, on the day of the funeral, the space he had not been able to bring himself to touch, and understood that some part of that emptiness would never fully close, that Yuna's absence was not a wound that healed so much as a shape his life would carry forward permanently, altered by it. The way a tree grows around a fence post driven into its trunk, never expelling it, only building new rings of life around the old injury year after year. He had believed, in the rawest days after her death, that nothing could grow around a loss that large. Sitting in her garden with her daughter asleep against his chest, he began to understand that Sun-hee had been right from the first night. A gift did not replace what was lost. It simply proved that his capacity to love had not been buried in the ground alongside his wife, however certain he had been that it was. He carried her back inside as the night deepened, settled her into the crib beneath the slowly turning paper cranes, and stood watching her for a long moment before finally allowing himself to leave the room and seek his own bed. For the first time in 18 days, he slept without waking at every small sound the house made. And if he dreamed that night, he did not remember it in the morning, only that he woke rested in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. 4 days later, the household gathered in the nursery for what should have been an ordinary evening. Nurse Min-jin stood near the changing table, preparing a bottle for the next feeding. Madame Sun-hee had settled into the chair beside the crib, humming softly, continuing a habit she had developed of sitting with Hana. In the quiet hour before her evening bottle, Tejin stood near the window, going over the day's business with half his attention, while the other half, as it always did now, remained tuned to the small sounds of the room behind him. Daejo entered without knocking, his expression tight with the particular urgency that meant he had found something that could not wait until morning. "Sir," the symbol on the cloth, "I finally got a match." He held a folder but did not open it yet, his eyes flicking briefly to Sun-hee and back to Tejin, weighing whether to speak freely in front of her, and apparently deciding there was no time to ask for privacy. "It doesn't belong to any criminal family we've ever catalogued. It doesn't belong to any of the Chable houses either. It appears in a sealed historical archive, sir, one that shouldn't have been accessible at all. And here's the part that concerns me most. Someone tried to delete the record the same week we started searching. Whoever they are, they know we're looking. And they don't want us to find." He stopped mid-sentence, because Hana had begun to stir in her crib, and something in the way she moved made every adult in the room go quiet without quite understanding why. She turned her head slowly, with a deliberateness that seemed impossible for an infant not yet 3 weeks old, directly toward Tejin. Her small face, usually soft and unfocused in the way of newborns, sharpened into an expression of strange, unsettling clarity, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. She lifted one small hand toward him, and then, in a voice too clear and too formed to belong to a child 18 days old, a voice that should not have existed yet in any physical sense, she said, a single word: "Daddy." The bottle slipped from Nurse Min-jin's hand and shattered against the floor, formula spreading in a pale pool across the tile that no one moved to clean. Daejo's mouth remained open around whatever he had been about to say, the words gone entirely from him. Madame Sun-hee closed her eyes slowly, her face settling into an expression of quiet, resigned certainty, as though something she had feared and half expected had finally, unmistakably arrived. Tejin could not move. He stood frozen at the window, staring at his daughter, unable to process what he had just heard, unable to summon any of the discipline or control that had guided every other moment of his life. The child had been in his home for 18 days. She should not have known how to speak. She should not have known who he was, not in any way that could produce a word, a name spoken with such clear and impossible intention. And somewhere beyond the estate walls, in a room no one in that nursery could see, a man watching a security feed on a bank of monitors picked up his phone, dialed a number, and said quietly into the dark, "The gift has awakened." No one in the nursery slept that night. Dejo canceled every meeting on Tejin's calendar for the following morning without asking permission, and for the first time in 15 years, Tejin did not correct him for it. By dawn, the folder Dejo had been holding when Hana spoke sat open on the study desk, its contents finally read in full, and what it contained rearranged everything Tejin had believed about the last 18 days. The symbol belonged to a bloodline the city had been told, 5 years earlier, no longer existed. The Huang family, once the quiet co-founders of half the shipping and security infrastructure that men like Choi Young-sik had since claimed as his own, had been erased from Seoul's underworld the way empires sometimes were, not through headlines, but through a single winter when every adult who carried the Huang name was declared dead within the same 6 weeks, the official causes ranging from accident to illness to nothing at all. Choi had absorbed their holdings before the ash was cold, and had spent 5 years since insisting, whenever the old name surfaced, that the bloodline had ended with them. It had not ended. Dejo's contact inside the property registry had found what Choi had tried to erase twice, a sealed birth filing, quietly opened and quietly closed again, 8 months earlier, for a daughter born to Hwang Seren, the last surviving heir, a woman the world believed had died in that winter 5 years before, but who had in fact been hidden, pregnant and terrified, inside a private hospital wing that Kang Tejin's own foundation quietly funded, under a name that meant nothing to anyone who read it, arranged without Tejin's knowledge by the one person in his life who had never needed his permission to be kind. Yuna, the nurse who had cared for Hwang Seren through the final months of her pregnancy, and who had promised her, in the last conversation the two women ever had, that the child would be placed somewhere Choi's people would never think to search, had kept that promise on the only night that guaranteed no one would question a stranger's basket appearing near a funeral procession. She had watched Tejin's convoy from a parked sedan long enough to see him step out into the rain himself, and had left before the police or anyone else could ask her why a stranger was standing in an abandoned lot in a storm. Hwang Seren had died 3 days after giving birth, of complications no hospital dared officially record, in the same wing where Yuna herself had once received treatment, in a room down the hall from the one where Tejin had held his wife's hand through her final week. The two women had never met, and yet their daughters, in the strange arithmetic of grief and mercy, had been born into the same house, by the same rain. The Huang bloodline, the filing made clear, was not sentimental, it was structural. Buried in trust documents Choi had spent 5 years trying to nullify were controlling shares in 3 of the city's largest security and shipping conglomerates, dormant since the winter the Huangs died, waiting on a single condition to reactivate, a living heir confirmed by blood, before her 5th birthday. Choi had believed he had years left to bury the last loose thread. He had not accounted for a dying woman's final act of mercy, or for a mafia boss who stopped his car for a sound most men would have missed in the rain. "He's known for weeks," Dejo said grimly, laying the last page down. "The calls to the hospitals, the sedan at the perimeter, the doll on the wall, that wasn't someone hunting a lost child out of guilt, sir. That was Choi confirming his last problem was still breathing before he decided how to finish it." Tejin read the filing twice in silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice held none of the shock that had frozen him in the nursery the night before. It held something colder. "Then he will learn what it costs to reach for what's mine twice." The reckoning came 7 nights later, not with an ambush at the estate gates, but at the glass tower on the river where Choi Young-sik had spent 5 years rebuilding his empire on a foundation of borrowed graves. Tejin walked into that boardroom without an army, because the army he brought was paper. 5 years of financial records Daejo's people had spent a week assembling, proof of falsified death certificates, of trust accounts drained the same month the Huangs disappeared, of a winter engineered rather than suffered. He laid it on the table in front of men who had spent a decade calling Choi untouchable, and watched the color leave every face in the room except Choi's own, which only tightened, the way a man's face tightens when he understands the room has already turned, before anyone has spoken a verdict aloud. "You buried a family and called it inheritance," Tejin said quietly. "I have a daughter who will grow up to reclaim everything you stole from her mother's grave, and every man in this room now has a signed copy of exactly how you took it." Choi's answer was not words. It was the 2 men who came through the private elevator behind him, and for the length of 11 seconds the room became the kind of violence Tejin's life had always eventually returned to: a table overturned, a shot fired into the ceiling, Daejo's body moving between Tejin and the door with the same instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years. It ended the way it always did when Tejin walked into a room already holding the paper trail that mattered more than the guns, with Choi's own board turning on him before the police ever arrived, unwilling to go down with a man now proven, in writing, to have murdered his way into every seat at that table. Choi was arrested before midnight on charges that would outlast whatever money he had left to fight them with. His empire did not survive the week. It dissolved into the hands of men, suddenly eager to distance themselves from him, several of whom found it prudent to sell their stakes, quietly and cheaply, to a buyer represented by Park Daejo. The city's underworld reorganized itself around a new and inconvenient fact within a month: that the Kang name and the Huang name were now, through a sleeping infant, the same family, and that the man who had once been feared for what he was willing to destroy was now, unexpectedly, feared for what he had chosen to protect instead. 1 year later, the garden behind the Kang estate was no longer overgrown. Someone had finally trimmed the roses back into shape, though the paper crane still turned above a crib that had, by then, been replaced with a proper bed, small and white, tucked beneath a window that looked out over the same stone bench where a father had once made a promise to a sleeping child beneath Yuna's stars. Hana turned 1 on a bright afternoon in early autumn, in a garden full of people who, a year earlier, would have called it impossible that Kang Tejin's estate could ever again hold the sound of that many people laughing at once. Madame Sunhee sat with a paper crane in her lap that she was folding for the child, slower now than she used to, but no less certain in her hands. Dr. Seo stood near the roses arguing good-naturedly with Nurse Min Jin about whether a 1-year-old truly needed to be monitored during her own birthday cake. Daejo stood near the gate, as he always did, watching the perimeter out of habit even on a day that no longer required it, though when Hana toddled toward him on unsteady legs and lifted her arms to be picked up, he set the habit down without hesitation and lifted her instead. Choi Young-sik spent that afternoon 200 kilometers away, in a cell he would not leave for a very long time, his name stripped from every building it had once been carved into, his empire folded quietly into legitimate hands, the last of the Huang holdings finally administered under a trust that named, as its future beneficiary, a little girl who had spent her first hour of life dying in the rain and had not stopped surprising the people who loved her since. Tejin knelt in the grass that afternoon and watched his daughter reach for a paper crane spinning slowly in the autumn light, her small hand closing around it the same way it had once closed around his finger through the bars of a crib, the same way it had once found his jaw in the rain, seeking something she already, somehow, knew was there. He thought, watching her laugh at nothing in particular, of a prophet's warning half understood for months, of a wife's note folded still in his desk drawer, of a promise made beneath the stars to a child who could not yet understand the words but had never once, in a year, doubted that he meant them. Blood may decide what a person inherits, but it is love, freely chosen and faithfully kept, that decides what a person is worth protecting.